Welcome to Books at Berklee. I'm Judith Pinnolis, Associate Director for Instruction and Engagement at the Berklee Library. And today we're having a discussion with Dr. Leonard Lehrman about his autobiography, Continuator, the Autobiography of a Socially Conscious Cosmopolitan Composer. Dr. Lehrman is a renowned musician, teacher, and composer. He is founder and conductor of the Metropolitan Philharmonic Chorus. Dr. Lehrman has taught at Cornell, Empire State College, and Hebrew Union College in New York. He and his wife, soprano Helene Williams, have performed over 700 times on 4 continents and on 17 CDs in 17 languages and posted over 5,000 YouTube videos with over 1 million views to date. Dr. Lehrman is author of biobibliographies of and completion of the works by Mark Blitzstein and Elie Siegmeister. His musical compositions include over 100 translations, adaptations, 12 operas, 7 musicals, and 252 other vocal and instrumental works. Perhaps most famously, Dr. Lehrman completed the unfinished works of Mark Blitzstein, including Idiots First and the opera Sacco and Vanzetti, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Here is today speaking with us about his Continuator, the Autobiography of a Socially Conscious Cosmopolitan Composer, published by Dorrance Press, which includes an entire chapter on Boston. Welcome, Dr. Lehrman, to Books at Berklee.
Thank you, Judy. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be talking to a Boston audience. And one thing you didn't mention is that I was a member of the self-styled worst class ever of 1971 at Harvard. Radcliffe, and that's what Nathan Pusey called us. But most of us, are very supportive of what Harvard is doing now to stand up to tyranny. I wanted to say that. And the connection that I have to Boston is, the connections are manifold. And as you say, there's a whole chapter in the book about it. And I hope we'll be talking about a number of those connections. One of those connections is to you. I owe you a tremendous amount for having chaired the Jewish Music Roundtable of the Music Library Association, where I gave a lecture on Jewish opera back in Seattle and about 30 years ago. And that lecture resulted in contact with Ken Jaffe, who wrote a book on Jewish opera, and then hired me to do my service in Florida. And his ex-wife's brother then hired me for my present position as High Holidays music director for the Metropolitan Synagogue, which was Leonard Bernstein's synagogue. And we'll talk about Leonard Bernstein too. I met him at Harvard and have a lot to say about that too.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm certainly glad you're here today talking about your book. I just wanted to start for our audience talking a little bit about the title. You called it Continuator. What does that mean, and how did that come about? What do you mean by Continuator?
I was inspired by my teacher and mentor, Elie Siegmeister, and also by Leonard Bernstein, to complete works of Mark Blitzstein. I completed 21 of them, including the work that Ned Rorem called his best work, Idiots First, based on a story by Bernard Malamud, who also taught at Harvard and Bennington. And then Sacco and Vanzetti was his magnum opus, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize after many, many years. It took me 25 years to finish it and 21 years to get it produced with orchestra. And I completed these works, and Elie Siegmeister, who inspired me to this, said on his deathbed, "I know when I die, if I leave something unfinished, you'll finish it, because you're my continuator," he said. And I have finished a few of his works, many more of Blitzstein, but I did author biobibliographies of each of them. They were very dear to me, Blitzstein posthumously and through his family and many people I knew who knew him. And Siegmeister was like a father figure to me. And I've done over 100 concerts of music of each of them.
Wow.
So it was Elie's word, continuator, that I took.
Well, that's really good to know. I was going to ask you why you chose to write an autobiography, and what is your main message that you'd like to get across to our audience in terms of is it all the activities, or your book reads in a very folksy manner. I mean, people can easily read it. It has a lot of information about all sorts of individuals that you've met and worked with over the years. And so it's sort of like sitting down in a room with a friend kind of style of writing. And wanted to find out your more about your message.
Well, the question of why I decided to write this book at this time was when the opera was nominated for Pulitzer Prize, I even though it didn't win, I felt that I'd reached a kind of a plateau in my career. Didn't know if I'd ever get any higher. Although, you know, a Deems Taylor Award would be nice. A Guggenheim grant would be even nicer, and of course, a MacArthur grant would be something to dream of. And all of these things could be very productively used to finish things that I've been continuing and finishing, but are still in many ways unfinished. The production of Sacco and Vanzetti was a difficult endeavor, and we put together a videotape from it, which has been shown internationally. But the definitive version of many of the works of Mark Blitzstein and Leonard Bernstein have been, and Kurt Weill for that matter, have been done by John Mauceri. And I've been trying for years to try to get John to do this. The Cradle Will Rock of Blitzstein was Leonard Bernstein's debut at Harvard, and it was also mine 30 years later. It was when Bernstein heard about my production, he said, "I'm glad somebody at Harvard still has taste." And when I met him, he knew who I was, and he fostered and blessed and helped with my work on Blitzstein. But there's still so much more to do. Well, Bernstein's own Candide was really only realized at the Scottish Opera by John Mauceri. Blitzstein's The Cradle Will Rock was really only realized in his original orchestral conception at Saratoga by John Mauceri. And I've been trying to get him interested in this, but Sacco and Vanzetti, of course, has a specific Boston ambiance and environment, and it's a Boston story. In fact, part of it is based on the novel Boston by Upton Slayer, which had some primary sources about Sacco and Vanzetti, the Italian immigrants and anarchists who were executed for a crime they did not commit, and were exonerated 50 years later by Governor Michael Dukakis. I had the great pleasure of corresponding with and then finally meeting Governor Dukakis at our latest reunion 3 years ago. And he's still alive. His wife just passed away, but he's still alive. And I'm hoping that he'll get to see a real full production of Sacco and Vanzetti in Boston in time for the centennial of their execution, which is 2027. And I would urge all of you in Boston to push for a Boston production of this. Gil Rose is a magnificent conductor. He has done such marvelous work, including Ballet Mécanique by George Antheil, which was completed in a form that couldn't be done during his lifetime by my brother, Paul Lehrman, who is at Tufts on the faculty there. And Gil Rose is a very, very busy man, but you want something done, you should ask a busy man or a busy person. And I keep hoping that Sacco and Vanzetti is going to get the production that it deserves, particularly in Boston. It's one of the reasons I talk so volubly about Boston in the book, and we want to talk more about Boston here.
Yeah, so I remember when I first came to the Brandeis Library, there's a Sacco and Vanzetti room with a large plaque in memory of them.
Yeah.
You've interacted with so many famous musicians and composers, many of which are, mentioned in the book. And I'd like to start asking you about some of, you've already mentioned Bernstein, you've already mentioned some of the other musicians that have had an impactful impression upon you. Who would those be, and what are the kinds of things or work you've done with them?
When I was at Harvard, people used to say that Leonard Lehrman is a cross between Leonard Bernstein and Tom Lehrer. And in fact, when I was living at Dunster House, I decided I wanted to meet Tom Lehrer, and I found him in the Cambridge phone book, right above my name, Lehrer before Lehrman. I called him up, and I said, "I'd really like to meet you." He said, "Come on over." So I bicycled over there at 7 o'clock. I didn't get home until 3 in the morning. I learned more in that session with him about his work and about songwriting than any other session like that at Harvard. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And we stayed in touch over the years. The first thing I said to him was, I know most of your songs by heart. He said, your friends must hate you. And then he proceeded to show me things that were not published. Oh, yes, I brought along a songbook that was arranged by somebody. And I said, I don't think that this harmonization here is exactly accurate. And he said, let's look at the urtext. And he put on the LP. Because that's how he worked. You know, he wrote mostly by ear, and he wrote vocal lines, but accompaniments were largely improvised. And he in fact, he never performed anything exactly the same way twice. So, but he was an inspiration, and he's in the book because, as a continuator, I took it upon myself to finish some of his work. He wrote a song called Clementine, which has a verse by if professional songwriters had written if professional composers had written songs instead of being a folk song, you know what it would be like to have Cole Porter or Mozart or Dizzy Gillespie write a song. He left out a verse that he never performed, but he showed it to me. It was Giancarlo Monotony verse, the ruby lips above the water, oh, and with gold, what I could do with that gold. It was hysterical. But if you didn't know Menotti, it was kind of esoteric. So he never performed it, I think, and he never recorded it, never released it, wouldn't let me copy it. But I remembered it, and then years later, I filled in a verse when I was performing for the Jüdische Gemeinde in Berlin. I created a Clementine Kaddish. and I performed that everywhere. And when we were out in California visiting him in 1991, I played it for him, and he said, "Well, it's a lot more sophisticated harmonically than I would write, but sure, go ahead." You know, he authorized it, and I registered it with ASCAP and everything. While we were in California, he handed me his song, which he had just written, Hanukkah in Santa Monica, which is about where you're spending the Jewish holidays. And I took that and I performed it at Temple Sinai in Roslyn, where I did bar mitzvah. I did a concert there and performed it. A lady came up to me and said, I have a 5-year-old grandson. He's learning the Jewish holidays and he sings all the time. Can I have a copy of that song? I said, well, yes, but it doesn't have all of the holidays. So I wrote a second verse, which included all the holidays that Tom Lehrer had left out, and he approved it. He in fact he applauded it. I said, "Have a Pesach in your Pesach, go away," and he said, "Your Pesach rhyme is a little bit of a stretch, but all I could think of was I always get my ass over to Tel Aviv for Passover, and then it wouldn't be a family song, you know." But he really liked what I did with, for example, if you love to fish, you love the Vishtula Tisha B'av, good yantiv, so make it good. And he said, who was the last composer the first composer to rhyme Tisha B'av with love? Answer, Meredith Willson. Here's love. A goy, of course, but you know, and he really liked my setting until the Brandeis Gay Men's Chorus also came up with a second verse, which didn't include many of the holidays that I had included, but they did have a rhyme in it that he particularly liked, which was, for Sukkos, I just sit on my tuchus. So he liked that one. But then another thing that
we'll have to know a few Yiddish words to get the benefit of these puns.
Well,
I was going
to. Judy, the Elements is another work that he left unfinished. That is to say, he finished in 1958 when there were only 102 elements. Now there are 118 with 2 more named. So, you know, if the 2 that have been given names with haven't been synthesized yet brings it up to 120. And you know the expression, "Oif bis 120," which we should all live to be 120. So I finished. I wrote a third verse for the Elements that takes it up to 120. So those are my Tom Lehrer completions.
I have not heard that, but I will really love to hear that sometime.
It's on YouTube.
Very good. So we will get a link to that. So another aspect of your title is the socially conscious cosmopolitan composer. And I was going to ask you about the term cosmopolitan and explain it why you included it in the title of your book. So traditionally, just for some of our audience who may not know, or students, the term cosmopolitan has often been combined with the adjective rootless and applied to mean Jewish people. as rootless cosmopolitans and members of the Jewish diaspora, diaspora meaning people who do not live in the original land of Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel from the ancient times when they were expelled. It was called diaspora. And it often indicates a sense of alienation from mainstream culture or so on. So in your book, you reveal how rooted your family is actually in part of the, musical life of this nation, and you are, and you've interacted with so many people. And I was going to ask you why you chose to use that term, given how much a part of the musical infrastructure of our country you've been part of in so many ways.
Well, I do pride myself on um, being able to converse in and understand many languages. Actually, my wife sings in 17 languages, even though she doesn't speak them. I speak 8. And when I was in Moscow for, I've been to conferences in Moscow twice. Since 1971, I was one of the youngest members of the International Music Congress. And then in 1985, I was one of the oldest members of uh, the Festival of Young People and Students. And I was appalled at the poor translations that were going on. So I would give speeches in English and then translate them into Russian and then translate them into German. And Andrei Eshbai, who was presiding, he's a eminent Soviet composer, proclaimed me as Leonard Lehrman, polyglot, is what he called me. Polyglot meaning someone who knows many languages. And I was
Right.
thinking of using the word polyglot in the title, but it's a little bit obscure. And so people said, well, Cosmopolitan will be more understandable. I was just hoping it wouldn't be associated with the magazine, which of course is not my intention at all.
That's another use of the term. Yeah. So you're meaning it in the sense of, a person who is involved in many different cultures and a person who's
That's
involved
right.
in many languages and cultures and interactions. Thank you. And I think that helps
See, my my
explain.
my, my mother called herself a person between two cultures. She was a Soviet citizen and came to America in 1935 at the age of 12 with no English. She learned English to the point that she could speak it and correct it better than anybody I ever knew. She was amazing, and she was really between two cultures, and she was the переводчица, the translator for Solomon Mikhoels, the greatest Yiddish actor and director who ever lived, who came to America and Boston to raise millions of dollars for Russian war relief. When we were giving concerts in Babruysk and Vitebsk and Moscow, and we mentioned that my mother had worked with Mikhoels, all of a sudden we were treated like royalty. We had to sign books and take selfies. Everybody knows Mikhoels was the great leader of the Jewish people who was killed by Stalin, who pretended that it was an accident. But there's an opera about him. I performed excerpts from that, and uh, my mother became an American citizen on D-Day, and she married my father 12 days later. My father had actually met her at in Boston, in downtown Boston, at a dance, a Valentine's Day dance, or actually it was Friday the 13th of 1942, and Friday the 13th has always been a lucky day in our family ever since then. He met her on that day, and fell in love with her. Swore he would marry her, and bet his roommate $5 that he was going to marry her, and he married her after he became 21, and was able to marry her without permission from his parents. And well, they used to say about my father that for his parents, only the Jewish Queen of England would be good enough for him. And in my book, there's a picture of my mother next to a picture of the Queen of England, and you can see that she was just as beautiful and he was in love with her from the very beginning to her dying day. They were married 70 years, and he lived another 5 years, but really it was only half there. I did, however, bring him to his 75th Harvard reunion. That he was class of 42, so this was in
75th,
2017.
say, wow, 75th. Oh,
2 years after my mother died, I brought him to his 75th Harvard reunion, and he was of the whole class, there were only 10 members that had made it. And I said, Dad, you made the minion. And then I had to explain to the other 9 members, none of whom were Jewish, what a minion was. You need 10 Jewish men or 10 people to have a prayer be considered legitimate. And so he was there, and he made the minion. And of course, the reason that the other 9 members were not Jewish was that in Dad's day, there was a quota, thanks to President Lowell. I think it was a 15% quota on admitting Jews. And that changed in our time. It went up to almost a third, I think, and it's back down again now. But it's not due to a quota system. It's due to the rise and encouragement and empowerment of other minority groups. So I'm a member of the Harvard Jewish Alumni Association, which is monitoring this and
Can you tell us,
supporting.
can you tell us a little bit more about your interactions with Leonard Bernstein? I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. Well, he came to dinner at Dunster House on December 2nd, 1969, and he had heard about my production of The Cradle Will Rock the month before, and he was supposed to have dinner and then go conduct a choral rehearsal for the Boston Symphony in Beethoven's Ninth. He never got to that rehearsal. He stayed with us until 3 o'clock in the morning, talking in Dunster House about musical theater and about Mark Blitzstein and about himself and about The Cradle Will Rock, and he was fascinated and fascinating. And I remember he said to me at one point, he just sort of looked at me and said, what do you think of Crosby, Stills and Nash? And I said, well, actually, I've heard of them, but I haven't. You don't know Crosby, Stills and Nash? Man, you're out of it. So of course I went and listened to Crosby, Stills and Nash. But he also talked about how he had been asked to write the musical Hair, and he felt that the plot was impossible, and he didn't write it. And eventually he said they threw out the plot anyway. And then he also talked about writing a film about St. Francis with Zeffirelli, and it was supposed to be St. Francis as a hippie, and he wrote a lot of music, and then gradually the film got more and more religious, and he got less and less interested, so he pulled the music out. And I think Donovan eventually wrote the score for that film. It's called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. And he said to us in that room in Dunster House, he says, I have a whole room full of religious music. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with it. I'm going up to the McDowell Colony to figure it out. That's what became Mass. That music went into Mass. So then a year later, he came to Lowell House for a production of a triple bill, which was the Boston premieres of I've Got the Tune, The Harpies, both by Mark Blitzstein, and Trouble in Tahiti, which Bernstein had dedicated to Blitzstein. He came with his wife, Felicia, and I can still hear him yelling bravo at the end of I've Got the Tune, and then at the end of the whole thing. And he came up and embraced me. And in the meantime, I had, on Nellie Siegmeister's suggestion, gone down to visit with the Blitzstein estate in Philadelphia, looked at some of the unfinished scores, and realized that the style that they were being written in was very close to my own style. I had completed a cycle on the poems of Carl Shapiro called The Bourgeois Poet, and there was a passage in there that was very similar to a passage in Idiot's First that Blitzstein had left unfinished. And I played this for Bernard Malamud when I was up at the Bennington Composers Conference, and he really liked what he heard of mine, and he gave me the authorization to complete the Blitzstein work, but I still needed Bernstein's authorization. So he came on December 5th, 1970, and after the curtain call, we met with him, and I asked him about completing Idiots First. He said, you really want to finish Idiots First? I said, I'm going to try. And he took me in his arms and said, God bless you. So I felt I'd been anointed, and then 3 years later, I finished it and I played it for him. Actually, what happened was, it's kind of interesting. I played it first for Nellie Siegmeister and for Bernard Malamud, and for Joe Davis and the Blitzstein estate, and they wanted me to play it for Bernstein because he was a musical executor of Blitzstein's estate. So I called up Helen Coates, and she said, well, Mr. Bernstein's very busy right now. He's writing the Dybbuk with Jerome Robbins, but I'm sure he's glad to know that you've done this. So Joe Davis of the Blitzstein estate said, call David Diamond. Well, David Diamond was a very fine composer and a very close friend of both Blitzstein and Bernstein. And so I called Diamond and asked him if he'd like to hear the opera. He said, "What? You finished that? Nobody could finish it. It's impossible. I saw that opera. All right, come and play it for me." So I came to his studio at Juilliard, and he played, and he said, "Oh my God!" He said, "Yes, I remember this now. Mark played it for me. It's beautiful." And I must have been shown the wrong opera. He was shown another opera called Magic Barrel, based on a Bernard Malamud story, which was barely started, and everybody agreed at that point that it couldn't be finished. But he said this could be finished. Lenny said it could be finished, and yes, it could be. And you have finished it, and you've done such a beautiful job. Now I'm glad I was shown the right opera. I might have been tempted to finish it myself, but you've done such a beautiful job. I'm going to tell Lenny. I got home. There's a message from Helen Coates. Mr. Bernstein is taking a breather. He would like to see you. So on January 17th, I drove into Manhattan, and I went to his apartment, where he introduced me to his daughter, Nina, who he told me was named after a heroine of Mark Blitzstein. And he introduced me to his wife, whom I'd already met once in 1970. And he said, "Well, what are we going to do now?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to sit down and play this for you, and you'll turn pages for me." He said, "Okay." So he sat down, and he turned pages for me. And while he was turning pages, he started singing along an octave lower. And when we got to the end of the first scene, which was not complete in the original, and I had completed it, he was still singing along. And at the end of the opera, he embraced me and said, "Yes, you've done a beautiful job. I'm going to do everything that I can to help you to get it produced." And it's had four productions at Cornell in Indiana, at the Bel Canto, where it won the award for most important event of the season of off-Broadway opera that year. And then Center for Contemporary Opera did it with orchestra for the first time. That version is on YouTube. And it's a beautiful opera. Ned Rorem wrote to me that Mark had played the work for him, and that he considered it Mark's best work. It's a gorgeous opera, one of the most beautiful Jewish operas ever written. And Malamud was very pleased and hinted that if we had trouble producing it, that I could perhaps write another opera based on a work of his. And I did. In fact, I wrote two of them. I wrote a companion piece based on his notes from a lady at a dinner party called Carla. And then years later, after his death, but with the approbation of his wife, I wrote Suppose a Wedding, based on his only published play. He called it a scene of a play, which kind of begs the question: is it a scene of a larger play, or is it a play in one scene? I treated it as a play in one scene. And it's a delightful piece that was premiered at Hebrew Union College, where I later taught the only course, as far as I know, that's ever been taught in Jewish opera.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Um, I want to move along now to more about your own compositions, not the completions and not the arrangements, but I was particularly interested in your songs for voice and piano. You know that about me. I noticed your listings of the works and that there are solos by a number of, many, many poets. And some of them are more known to me than others. One of them was Rosalie Calabrese. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your approach, your compositional style, and writing for voice. I mean, that's really fascinating to me, and I wanted to talk to you about that.
I regret very much that I can't share a recording of Yellow Cabs, which is my setting of Rosalie's poem. It's at the American Music Center online library, which has been taken over by New Music USA, and unfortunately screwed up because you can't access it. You can read about it, but you can't listen to anything in that library anymore. It's been true for a couple of years. I've been screaming about it every year. They should do something about it. So I don't have a record, but I think we may make a recording of it on June 15th, because I know you want to hear it. And it's a delightful poem that ends with taxi, And Rosalie was a delightful person, and as you know,
And
and you probably knew her better than I. Yeah, I've set poems to music in many cultures and many languages. I kind of found my own voice setting a Mayakovsky poem to music when I was at Harvard, and it was performed at Harvard and at Boston University by Rip Keller and Greg Sandow, who's a very well-known critic now. And it was from a cycle of his called You Blue, I Love, and the section was called My University. And it was a critique of all these people that are so nasty to each other as colleagues in universities, and it seemed very appropriate in 1970 when there was bitter division among those of us who were politically engaged and those who didn't want to be bothered, and so my university, I set to be sung in English or in Russian, and in fact every time it's been performed first in one language and then in the other. It was done for the Mayakovsky Centennial at Lehrman College when was that? 1990, and it was the first of my Russian songs. I've written 8. They were most recently recorded in St. Petersburg with the St. Petersburg State Symphony, Helene, and a Russian bass. I wanted a bass, but they gave me a baritone. But it's a very nice recording that I did with Joel Mandelbaum. And so Russian was the first venture that I had in setting music in a foreign language and writing my own English translation to go with the text. I've done that with a Chekhov play that we staged at Cornell, and that I've staged since then as an opera. It's called the play is called Jubilee, the Jubilee, or the celebration. It's about a bank on its 15th anniversary. I called it the birthday of the bank. And I wrote a translation. I set the original Chekhov text to music in Russian, and then I wrote an English translation to go with the music, which is different from many of the other translations. And it's had several productions in English. There's a director in St. Petersburg that wants to do it in Russian. I hope that he can sometime. When we were last in St. Petersburg, we saw the premiere of King Lear by Sergei Solonimsky in the Russian translation of the Shakespeare play by Boris Pasternak. Brilliant, beautiful work, which I translated back into Shakespeare's English for production. I don't know when or where, but I'm hoping that it'll be done. So yeah, opera is my primary concern. But as you say, I've written over 300 songs, and I've written them in 11 languages. On June 15th, a classmate of mine named Geza Tatrayai has written a cycle in Hungarian or English, and I've set to music in English. His translations do not go. The music to his translation doesn't go very well with the original Hungarian. So he's going to read the Hungarian poems in Hungarian, and then we'll sing them in English. On the other hand, I also set a poem by Federico Garcia Lorca, Dawn in New York, in an English translation. It doesn't go very well with the original Spanish. However, there's a poem called Acallarse by Pablo Neruda, which was published in Jewish Currents in what I thought was a very poor translation. I found the original Spanish, I set it to music in Spanish, and then I wrote my own translation to go with it, so it can be sung and has been sung in either or both languages. So language is a very important part of this, but I mean, I've also set poems to music just in English. Langston Hughes' Dream Deferred, Let America Be America Again, which is a magnificent poem that many people have set parts of. I think I'm the only one that set the whole thing. I also set The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman to music, the whole thing. And I try to find music that goes with the agogic accents of the original poems. There's a poet named Alex Skovron who was born in Poland, emigrated at the age of 7 to Israel and then to Melbourne, Australia. He's the child of Holocaust survivors, and he's written some fantastic poetry. He also invented a form called a sonatino, which is a 10-line sonnet. And I had been setting sonnets to music for years and calling them sonatinas. He contacted me on the internet to talk about sonatinas. We had 350 pages of correspondence before we ever spoke or saw each other. I wrote a whole song cycle based on poetry of his and his colleagues in Australia, and he assembled 6 of them to read their poetry on an evening when Helene sang my song cycle, An Australian Odyssey, based on 18 poems by these 12 Australian poets. And it's been very exciting, and I continue to work with him, and we're going to be doing a cycle of his on June 15th, which is brand new. One is of the poems is one of the most moving poems I've ever read in my life. It's called To My Half Brother, and it's written about the boy that he was named after, who died at the age of 2 at Auschwitz before Alex was born, and his father's first wife along with him. So you know, there's so much out there that is worth expressing and working with and enhancing with music. I mean, I like texts that leave room for the music. I mean, there are times when music is not really called for, but then there's a time when I have the feeling that the music is already there. It's like a sculpture that's in the stone. You just have to carve away the rock to find it. That's the process that I feel that I'm doing when I'm setting a text to music, whether it's in English alone or in another language, which is fascinating to me because I then construct a translation in most cases, and that limits. Does it go up? Does it go down? Is it long? Is it short? If you're working in two languages at the same time, you have double limits and limits, deadlines. They say what a composer needs to compose is a commission and a deadline, and and the limits of the composition can be very helpful.
Yeah, I
So
was just
does that
wondering,
give you an
have you
idea of compose?
said any poets in Yiddish?
Yes, Leibnidus was a contemporary of my grandmother. In fact, he was in Vilna when my grandmother was in uh, gymnasia there. I never got a chance to ask her. Never thought to ask her. I should have. She lived until 1990, 1989. And in 1981, I set one of his poems to music. He was known as the Jewish Keats. He died like Keats at the age of 28. But he had followers and societies and all kinds of things. And this poem called In der Fremde, Charlie Osborne, your friend of mine, sang it in Israel, and Harry Oshitsky sang it on German television. It was when we were founding the Jewish Music Theater of Berlin. In der Fremde, it's called, and in English or in German, not German, in English or in Yiddish, it's very effective. We sang this for as a duet. Ron Edwards and Helene sang it as a duet in Bayreuth when we were meeting with Wolfgang Wagner, the grandson of Richard Wagner, who of course had sat on Hitler's knee.
Yes.
And I asked, yeah, Gesundheit, and I asked him after we had a half an hour interview with him. At the end of it, we sang that piece for him. I told him that actually the accompaniment was kind of inspired by my coaching Meistersinger and Tannhäuser. It was very florid and fluid, and he said he was honored and he understood every one of the Yiddish words except the last word, sof. I had to translate that and said that means end, so it's the final Hebrew letter, and then I said to him, well, what can I do to persuade my relatives and friends in New York and Israel that there's no more anti-Semitism here? And he sort of turned pale. And then I said to him, and I didn't plan this actually, I just said spontaneously, how would it be if we were to do a concert here during the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth in Yiddish? And he took a deep breath and said, Warum nicht? Why not? And he sent us to Piano House Steingräber, where he says we do our Kleinkunst, our chamber music. And we were invited. This was 1996, and in 1998 we were invited back. Helene and I did the first Yiddish song recital there, and it was such a success. They invited us back 2 years later to do a program Heinrich Heine in 6 languages, including the Lorelei, set to music by Franz Liszt. And one of the great moments of my life, I got to play Liszt on Liszt's piano, which was
Wow.
right. Yeah, Liszt was only a year older than Wagner, but he was his father-in-law. Wagner
Wow.
had married his daughter, so the piano was there, and I got to play. And it was an ear opener because Liszt writes these thundering things in the bass, and that piano was not capable of making more than a moderately loud sound. It couldn't thunder the way a modern piano could. So when we know that when Liszt was writing that for that, he didn't really mean full power. And I learned that by playing his piano.
I was going to say to you that we should talk another time because there's so many new Yiddish poets now, young people who are writing in Yiddish. It's kind of an
Really,
interesting time. And we can talk about that because it would be great to see some of that set to music. I wanted to move on because we're going to run out of time if we don't. And there's so many significant pieces of your book, musical life and all your interactions. I do want to at least make sure we include a little bit about your work with uh, you have it also in your title, Socially Conscious, and I do want to mention that your work with People's Music Network and Pete Seeger, um, there's so much to that kind of work that you've been doing, and if we quickly shift to that so we can not run over too
Sure.
much.
No,
Uh,
Ellie Siegmeister was my door opener for that. I mean, he had been a member of the American Music League, which my mother's first cousin Rose Cabot had been the secretary of in the 1930s, and she recommended that we call Siegmeister. And when my piano teacher felt she couldn't teach me anymore, so I went to him, and I just turned 11, and he told my parents I don't take anybody that young. But I said to him, I was looking at all his scores, conducted by Toscanini and Metropolis, and I said, how long would it take to play all your scores? He said about a week. I said, well, it'll only take about 45 minutes to play everything I've written. You want to hear it? And so he said okay, and then he listened, and he said, take a walk around the block, and he said to my parents, I'll take him, and I became his youngest and longest student. And in 1963, my father took me to the March on Washington, and I came back and reported on the "I Have a Dream" speech of Dr. King, and other things, and it's all written up in my book. But in fact, I gave a speech at a Black Lives Matter march, which Helene videotaped. It's on YouTube, where I talked about the importance of that march, and how Dr. King embraced our white brothers and sisters who realized that our destiny is tied up with their destiny. Their destiny is tied up with our destiny, which is part of Ellie. See, then Ellie set to music that speech, commissioned by a synagogue in Long Beach, which was premiered in 1967, just 12 days after Dr. King gave his Riverside Church speech denouncing the war in Vietnam. And the American Legion threatened to picket the temple. It was horrendous. And the piece didn't really receive its proper due until 1989. I used to tease Ellie. I would say that so one day your birthday is going to be a national holiday. And it is, because Dr. King was born on his 20th birthday in 1929. And in 1989, it was Ellie's 80th and Dr. King's 60th. And we did I Have a Dream for the first time in Manhattan. It was done on WQXR and WBI for years after that. It was a tremendous success. Pete Seeger was there. And he came back and said to me, Leonard, I've always wanted to do a workshop with Eli, he mispronounced Eli as Eli, with Eli Siegmeister, about the Composers Collective, because my father, Charles Seeger, whom I had met at Cornell, by the way, when he was a very old man, fascinating fellow, my father co-founded the Composers Collective of New York with Eli Siegmeister and Mark Blitzstein and others. Can you bring Eli up to Beacon, New York, to Songs of Freedom and Struggle and People's Music Network for a workshop in June? And I did. I brought him up there. It took some doing. I had to find a singer that would sing some of his other songs. He didn't want just his political song, well, his round. But we did "Strange Funeral in Braddock," which was a magnificent piece. It was his first published composition. And I got John, who changed his name to Alden McCain. He was a hero of the AIDS crisis. He was a member of the of ACT UP, and Alden sang that song "Strange Funeral in Braddock," and this became a lifelong friendship between me and Pete. He did many other things with us after that. He wrote he translated from the Chosa, I think, a round called "The Stairway." We've been waiting here too long. Perhaps we should use the stairway. No, the stairway is dark. It's dangerous. Don't use it. If we all go together, I'm sure it's safe to use the stairway. So he challenged us composers to set that to music, and I did, and he was very happy with it. And I have quite a bit of correspondence with him. We also did, Joni Mitchell's most famous, most beautiful song, "Both Sides Now," has 3 verses. Pete wrote a 4th verse, which begins, "Daughter, daughter, don't you know, you're not the first to feel just so. And let me say before I go, it's worth it anyway." Beautiful 4th verse, which I arranged for duet so Helene and I could sing it, and Pete approved that. And we sang it in several concerts, including one honoring his 99th birthday. And David Amram was there. And David had danced with Helene, singing "If I Can't Dance, It's Not My Revolution" from E.G. At the last appearance that we had with Pete. It's on YouTube. And David wrote this encomium. You can't believe, he said, "I never heard that song Both Sides Now until I heard it sung by Helene." He said it was like hearing Caruso sing "Vesti la Juba" for the first time. I mean, he just waxed so poetically about Helene. Well, my darling Helene is the jewel of my life, and my better half for the better half of it. And she's right here. Come say hello before we have to sign off. Come on. She's wearing a Harvard shirt. She's an honorary member of the Harvard class of '71.
He's very cute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bend down. There you go.
Hi.
Oh,
Helene.
oh my
So
God.
nice
Hi,
to you.
darling.
Yes.
Weird
Thank
angles.
you. Well, I guess that this is going to be wrapping up our talk today. There's so many more areas that I wanted to get to, but we can everybody can find out more in the book, and by you also were a teacher and you've done all this writing, but the Continuator will be in our library. Students can check it out. And if you are interested in this book, go look for it and come by in the guest library.
Judy, make it clear that the book has three possible modes of purchase. The color version, it's like an art book. They're charging ridiculous amount of $126, which I think is only for libraries or gifts. But the black and white version is only $32, and the ebook version is only $27, and the ebook is actually in color. And you were telling me that the ebook is actually easier to read than the book because the binding is so stiff, right?
I have very bad eyesight, but I have looked at this book, and we're going to as with all of our books at Berklee, they will be at Berklee for students, faculty, and staff to come to the library and use. And I really appreciate you. Wow, talking today, I really enjoyed all those stories, and there are more stories like that in this book. And you can also use it as a reference for all of the people that are mentioned in the book. You've interacted with so many other musicians over the years, and students may find that there are all kinds of things that, anecdotes and stories and information that they're looking for about these other
mention the Boston
students.
connection. The Boston connection. I mentioned Howard Zinn many times. He inspired my most performed work, which is E.G., a musical portrait of Emma Goldman, and that's how I met Helene. She auditioned for that and walked off with the part in The Composer. So there are lots of Boston connections there, and also Nadia Boulanger. There are quite a few stories about her in the book too.
That's right. I mean, it really is. Well, it's over 500-page book. So there you go. Lots of stories. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining us for Books at Berklee today.
Thank you. My pleasure, Judy. Always a pleasure to do everything with you.